Imagine you've been diagnosed with a serious illness, perhaps even a life-threatening one. You're scheduled for a series of appointments on the same day for some lab work and scans and then to see a specialist. You navigate your way through traffic, finding the correct parking garage and then a parking spot. Now, how to get to your first appointment. You make your way through a maze of hallways and eventually find the waiting room. You're given various forms to complete with details of your medical history and other information. Primary care physician's name, address, and phone number. Previous hospitalizations and surgeries, if any, with dates and hospitals. Is all of this information really needed and needed right now? At last, it's your turn for the actual lab work and scans. And then you find your way to the doctor's office. More forms to complete, much of the same information as before, and then you wait. And wait. You wonder if there's time to grab something to eat, but decide you'd better stay put. You're so hungry. Eventually you're called in and the nurse asks about your medical history. Again. After answering still more questions, the doctor arrives. She describes your test results and what they mean. Unfortunately, the medical evidence isn't clear on a best course of treatment, she says, and goes on to describe several possible options. You do your best to understand and remember what she's telling you. It's a lot of information, including some that seems to conflict with what you read about online. Do you have questions, she asks? You ask the ones you've written down in advance. Then you try to review what she just told you to figure out if you have any others. You also realize there's no way you'll be back in time for that scheduled meeting or for dinner, and that you need to find a moment to let your colleagues and your family know. The doctor says they can get you scheduled for next steps depending on which treatment you decide to pursue. You're not sure whether to laugh, to cry, or to actually try to make a decision. Some years ago, I was in a similar situation. There were tears, uncertainty, and confusion. The decisions to be made seemed so daunting and so important. With no clear recommendation from the doctor, I needed to make them, and yet my thinking felt so muddled. Even basic information processing felt challenging, let alone more complex decision-making. Compare that with my daughter and her friends, who at the time were as inquisitive as 3-year-olds can be. Their minds were generating new and elaborate ideas, stories, and conjectures at a seemingly astounding rate, imagining and discovering all sorts of possibilities. And my mind, in the midst of those critical medical decisions, it felt so very far away from that. Not incapable, and yet incapable. Reflecting on that time and others since, I've often wondered how we might redesign systems and processes, how we might reimagine relationships and interactions in ways that help us all to think more easily, clearly, and effectively. Because good thinking, deep, nuanced, and creative thinking is arguably what we need most. It's what personal problems, organizational issues, and complex societal challenges all demand. And it's what we neglect at our peril. Crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic have only made that all the more clear. In my field, the birth of modern-day cognitive psychology is often referred to as the cognitive revolution. That revolution elevated the study of thought within the field of psychology. We need nothing short of a new cognitive revolution, one that elevates thinking not just within a field of study, but within our lives. A revolution centered on what I call cognitive kindness. So what is cognitive kindness? Let's start with kindness. When people talk about kindness, they often mention generosity and helping others without expecting anything in return. They speak of empathy, compassion, care, and even love. Cognitive refers to all that our minds can do, including our amazing abilities to reason and understand, to imagine and create, to dream and design, to envision and enact. Cognitive kindness, then, is about bringing generosity and caring to how we treat one another's thinking. It's about being kind to minds. It's a radically different form of kindness, one that's powerfully informed by research and what it reveals about how our minds work. And so it's kindness that's more likely to be powerfully effective. Cognitive kindness is about intentionally approaching what we do with one another's thinking as a key consideration, perhaps as the key consideration rather than as an afterthought, something taken for granted, or something entirely ignored. At its best, cognitive kindness not only recognizes but respects, liberates, and empowers the full cognitive potential of others. It's pretty striking. In fact, we seem to recognize the importance of treating resources such as money and time with care. Not that we always do. We need only look at some of our purchases or the amount of time we spend in meetings to realize that. And yet we aren't particularly attentive to or even aware of how we spend our own and others' mental resources. Even education, the arena supposedly dedicated to thinking and learning and what is possible, fails in many ways to prioritize the cognitive resources and potential of students, teachers, and staff. And yet, our minds may be our most precious and powerful resource of all. Cognitive kindness, then, being kind to minds, can be the difference between whether we, as individuals and societies, fail or flourish. How might we translate this principle into action? First, it's worth noting that when aiming to be kind to someone else's mind, it's important to proceed from an accurate understanding of how thinking actually works, an understanding centered on scientific evidence. In all its details and possibilities, that's a tall order, but it turns out many of us bring some valuable intuitions, ones at least somewhat aligned with the research evidence, to the task. For example, research demonstrates resoundingly that there are limits to the number of things our minds can work effectively with at any given time. And while we may be a bit deluded about exactly what that limit is, most of us at least realize that some limit exists. That's a useful starting point that we can expand on. We might envision our minds as gardens in which a variety of ideas and imaginings can take root and flourish. And what influences and grows in these gardens goes beyond the purely intellectual. Research tells us that our physical abilities, our social interactions, and our emotions all depend on and impact our mental life. They too are part of the garden. A garden is not unbounded. There's limited land, nutrients, and water to go around. Yet with care and attention to the timing and distribution of those resources, we can cultivate a thriving and sustainable ecosystem, an ecosystem of ideas that nourish each other while offering fertile ground for new possibilities. By reducing unnecessary demands on our cognitive resources, we essentially eradicate invasive weeds that would otherwise usurp space, nutrients, and sunlight, and we liberate those resources instead toward thoughts and ideas that might bear fruit or enrich the soil. Even this single understanding gives rise to a number of ways to be more cognitively kind. Let's return to the hospital to see how that might work. The hospital is a pretty important context, one where life and death decisions are being made, and one where ideally everyone's thinking is at its best. And yet our current systems and processes don't necessarily facilitate that for patients and families, or for that matter, for doctors, nurses, and other hospital staff. What if someone parked your car for you as a matter of course, or if a parking spot were reserved for you based on your schedule of appointments? What if someone greeted you directly at the hospital entrance and asked what you might need help with? What if you were provided more information about what to expect in advance, or asked to supply only the information that was truly necessary, and the doctor actually had time to carefully consider it before your appointment? What if information were shared more effectively across offices and hospitals? What if the layout of the hospital itself were more helpful to your processing and navigating? I've been to a hospital branch that's housed in what was formerly a shopping mall, preserving that basic layout. Think about the configuration and goals of a typical shopping mall. It's open with high visibility of what's available, not to mention often pretty ample parking, right? Remarkably different from a maze of parking garages and winding hallways, right? More cognitively kind, right? What if tasks were allocated or reconfigured so that your doctor could direct her attention to you rather than to typing what you're saying into the computer medical record system? What if your doctors and nurses had schedules that actually allowed for sufficient and regular sleep, meals, and breaks, not to mention the mental energy and space to think not only about what to tell you, but how to tell you? Of course, these are just a few suggestions, some better than others. Even in this one context, there are many more possibilities for cognitive kindness. Just as there are many ways to free up nutrients and space in a garden, there are many ways to liberate mental resources for others, including presenting information in a way that's easier to understand, restructuring a task, reassigning a responsibility, eliminating a task entirely, or perhaps even relaxing expectations and standards. Imagine that. And there are even more possibilities because freeing up cognitive resources isn't the only way to be cognitively kind. In fact, we've really only scratched the surface here, considering just one research finding, and in very general terms at that. Research reveals so much more that can be creatively marshaled toward cognitive kindness. Thinking can also be eased and improved by making it more accurate, more efficient, more creative, more thorough, more expansive. Research tells us that sometimes this might involve giving people more information to process, requiring more time, and encouraging more thinking, not less. What's more cognitively kind may vary across circumstances and individuals, in part due to differences in goals, personalities, knowledge, and other factors. And yet, the fundamental assertions of cognitive kindness are clear and unwavering. First, our cognitive abilities and resources are among our most valuable assets. And second, each of us has the power and responsibility to prioritize the thinking of others in what we do and design. Fundamentally, cognitive kindness is more than any single act. It's a philosophy that elevates the value of our minds and the possibilities they represent. It asks us to consider what we do in the context of how it affects the ability of others to use their minds as fully as they wish toward what they wish. Cognitive kindness reminds us that true inclusivity is more than simply offering someone a seat at the table. It requires intentionally designed interactions, processes, and spaces that actually empower each person's full cognitive potential. It's about no less than cognitive justice. Cognitive kindness orients us to others. Returning to the hospital, what is it like to be a patient who is perhaps also a wife, mother, daughter, sister, friend, and teacher, navigating her way through multiple options, multiple forms, financial considerations, and emotions amidst the myriad other aspects of her life? And what about the doctors and nurses who put their all into caring for patients and whose lives encompass so much more beyond the hospital walls, from everyday tasks like laundry and meals to more challenging matters such as parenting and the physical and mental health of their own families? Not to mention navigating possible bias and discrimination that can turn even common everyday decisions, like where and when to go for a run, into life and death ones. What information is each person trying to process and juggle? Cognitive kindness urges us to find out, or at least imagine, and then to use that understanding to facilitate the thinking of others. What cognitive kudzu can we eradicate or prevent from even taking root in the first place? What soil can we clear or amend? What might we shift to another garden? How might we let more light in? Cognitive kindness also encourages us to seek a deeper, more accurate understanding of how minds in general work. That's incredibly valuable knowledge in and of itself, says the cognitive psychologist, especially because some of our intuitions about how our thinking works are pretty far off the mark. And so we highlight the importance of continued research and of effective communication, cognitively kind communication of what that research reveals. In fact, we might ask ourselves why we don't make more of an effort to teach children and adults about their own thinking. What might be possible if we did? Cognitive kindness is powerfully generative. An investment from one or a few people to, say, take on family meal planning, write a clearer email, reconfigure an organization's job responsibilities, or design a national vaccine rollout and communication plan can liberate valuable mental energy for anywhere from 1 to tens, hundreds, or even thousands of individuals. Better thinking by those individuals can in turn impact many others. And imagine the potential benefit to collaborative efforts when each individual brings even slightly more cognitive capacity to the table. We find ourselves in a time of tremendous complexity, challenge, and opportunity. Significant long-standing issues such as climate change, systemic racism, and poverty call out for our very best ideas and thinking. Clearly, our cognitive resources, individual and collective, have never mattered more. And so cognitive kindness, being kind to one another's minds, becomes in essence an imperative, a responsibility. How much of a difference can any single act of cognitive kindness really make? A single act of cognitive kindness might just free up enough resources to facilitate the sprouting of a seed, the birth of an idea. And as TED and TEDx themselves highlight, ideas and their transformative power can spread. What ideas might a single, seemingly small act of cognitive kindness enable? And it's not just ideas that are valuable. Even a bit of liberated cognitive capacity might mean a better decision about a medical treatment made, an accident avoided, a sunset noticed and appreciated, a parent more fully present with a child. Let's start that next cognitive revolution, one that applies an evolving understanding of how our minds work in ways that help each of us move toward greater presence, creativity, and insight across all aspects of our lives and society. Healthcare, education, voting, taxes, meetings, communication, parenting, relationships, everyday interactions, and more. What might be possible if we're each more cognitively kind? Let's find out.